Welcome! In this video, we are going to create a to-do list so we can show how we can work post requests in an Express server. This first part of the video is going to focus on the front end, the to-do list, the elements, and styling those elements. Let's go into it here. We have an index.html file stored in a public folder within client. We also have the server folder, which has nothing in it. Not until later. Create that boilerplate code with an exclamation point and tab. Change that title. And let's start the elements. When I set this up, I want to have a wrapper element, which will have an ID of wrapper, and it should look like a div. Now, in the wrapper, we'll have two parent components. These parent components are going to represent the list container and the form container from top to bottom. We'll see what that looks like. We'll have a div of a list container and a class of parent container. This is the list container. In the list container, we'll have some list items. Actually, we're going to make an unordered list element. And in the unordered list element, we'll have some list items. Great. So what we just did here, we made a div, which is one of the parent containers called list container. And this list container is going to encompass or enclose an unordered list called list container actual. So if we were to style this here, this is where we'll be like, say, flex. This is where we can really flex these items out, make them spaced evenly, centered, or wherever. And in the unordered list, we have some list items. Now that we're done with the list items, actually we're not done. We have to add in some text. Let's say workout, play guitar, and eat dinner. And within these list items, we want to have a span that will represent the button to delete. So this is really going to be a button, but we're going to use a span element. And then we'll throw an X in there. And we should be good here. Now let's focus on that form container. We'll start with an ID of form container. That should come out with a div, but we do need a class of parent container. This class is going to allow us to style both list container and form container since they're in the same class element. Now within the form container, we have a form with an ID of form. Let's set up the action to API to do. We won't be using that now, but we will be using that for the server. All right, we'll have three elements in our form. We'll have a label, we'll have an input, and finally a button to submit. Let's style it up. Label dot, or actually just say label, and the for field will be to do. Let's give this some text of to do. Should show up here. Let's start the input with a type of text. And we must give the input a name to correspond with the label. So the name field will correspond with the for field. And if you can guess already, we're going to change that to do. And we'll have an ID of to do input. Finally, for that button, we'll start a button with a type of submit. Give it some text for post. And voila, we have our form field. So let's go over what we just did. In our second parent, we created a div with a form container ID, and we gave it the same class as the list, as the div up here. In this parent container, we got a form with an ID of form and an action of API to do. In the form, we have 3 components. We got label, input with a type of text, and a button to submit the text. So let's make sure it works. Hello world, post, and of course we'll get this message because we are not connected to the server. We did not create any routes, which is normal. So that is our front end elements, and then we'll go into the styling in a second here. Let's typically I would open up a CSS file, but for practical purposes, let's just do it here. We'll create a style element above the body, and we'll target all of our regular elements. So let's target everything and reset the margin and padding. Set the box sizing to border box. Once we got that, we have the body to mess with, and I want to change the background to silver. And I gotta flex everything to put it in the middle here. So I'll say display of flex, flex direction of column. Let's align the items to center, justify content to center, and give this a standard height of 100 view height. Great. I don't want these bulletins here, so I think I'm gonna target everything and take that out by getting the list style type property and changing that to none. Now we have the body set. It's centering our wrapper. That's what we're setting here. And now we just gotta target everything under the body. So let's get the wrapper, which is the next thing after body element. We can style this with a fixed height and width. I want it to look like like a card. So I'll say height 400 px, width 400 px, border 3 px, solid indigo, border radius, of 8 px, and of course we got to flex everything to make it a little bit cleaner. Let's flex that with the column. And there we have it. Now that we're done with the wrapper, we are set to our 2 parent components. So imagine we just got done getting this wrapper borders out of the way, and that's what this border represents. Now we got to get those 2 major components, the list container and the form container. Let's start with the list container and get that situated. What I want to do with both of my parent components, we can target both of them, list container and form container. We can say height 50%, width 50%, and let's give this display. Actually, let's show the border so you can really see how this works. Border radius, no, border 3px, solid green, and that's what it looks like for the borders. It's 50% high and 50% wide. If you want to change it to 100, be my guest. It's gonna get the whole width of its parent container, the wrapper. But for this one, let's change it to 50. And of course, we're gonna flex this here, display flex. We will take out the justify content center for this reason. We're gonna give each list container and form container their own justification. I want this form container to stay at the start position, but I still want my workouts, my list to be, my unordered list to be centered. I'll show you what I'm talking about. If we target each one exclusively, so let's say list container, justify content center. That means it doesn't touch the other container, it just stays at the list. We'll copy, paste, and target the form and change this to start. Great. So it looks like we're maintaining the same height and width, but we're just changing the justifications for each container. Now let's go inside of each one. We'll start with the list container, unordered list. List container actual, which is the UL. We want to give it a height and width of 100%. Kyle, why don't you inherit? Because if you inherit this, I'll show you what happens. First, let's just give it a border to 3px solid, somewhat of gray. Why isn't it targeting? Oh, because it's a class, it's not an ID. So why do we not inherit? That's what it looks like. Why do we not inherit the height and width of the parent? Because if we did inherit this, we're inheriting the 50% we get from the list container itself, from its parent. Because the list container is set to 50, and you're basically saying, hey, I want to get 50% too when I inherit. And if you inherit that, the code will take it seriously and make it 50% smaller than what you intended. So if you want to encompass everything, then just change it to 100% of the parent. Now we can display and flex everything out. And remember, we are just messing with the unordered list. We're not really getting the list items yet. Display flex, column center. Great. Flex direction, and now we just got to justify content to center. Now, when I justify this, I don't want to center. I actually want to space evenly. Good. So it'll take a certain percentage of the parent, and it's going to space it out just from this justification property. Now we have the x's to deal with. Let's target the span. Delete. Let's give this a border. You know what? Let's give it a height of 25px, a width of 25px, border radius of 8px, and border of 2px solid red, background of red, and a color of white. Okay. That looks a little too skinny right now, so we might want to, you know what? We can just scale this. Transform, scale 1.5. No, it's not scaling? Okay, let's just add some padding. Padding 16px. Too big, 6px. Cool. And what's great here, we can now we can mess with the list items. Our list items, which is a class of list item, the first thing we want to do here is flex out the list item. So we'll be flexing the text and the span. We want them to be not side by side, but on each side of the width. So we'll set a width of 100%. And let's give it a border of 2px solid black so you can see what it looks like. We'll flex everything out. I'm telling you, flexing is like the best thing ever alongside with grid because it really structures your code and you can understand how each element works. We're going to send a flex direction to row and we're going to space evenly. Actually, we're going to space between. Great. Once we have that set in our list item, let's give it a padding on each side as well. Padding of 0, 16px, just so we can take them away from the sides. And that's how it looks for the list container or the list items. Since that's complete, you see how the borders are working. Let's do something similar with the form container. We'll close that out since we're done here. And let's mess with the form container and style it the similar way. We already styled the form container and it has its own justification, right? Yes, it's justifying to the start position. It's not centered. So once we have that justified, let's go into styling the label. No, let's style the form. Target that ID of form, and we're going to treat it just like that unordered list where we send it to a display of flex. Let's flex it to the center and give this a column. For this form, we're going to give it a gap of 8px. We can get away with this because we have three elements that can work with this separation. We have the label, the input, and the button. They're all formed in a column, and we're pretty much gapping, give them spaces within the form. Now let's target the input with an ID of to-do input. This input will have padding of 4px, border radius of 12px, 8px, border of none to take away that nasty inline. Let's give it a text align of center. Now we can move on to the button. The button with a type of submit, it's already got text inside, but we do want to, it looks like it's exhausting its corners here. Let's give it a padding of 4px. Border will match the input, 8px. Border radius, 8px. Actually, what am I doing here? Border of none. We'll give it a background of violet and color of white. You know what? We're going to do the same thing here, color, for the list items. Give it some style. Great. And let's not forget our borders here. And that's our to-do list. So let's go over this again. We've styled our to-do list and sectioned everything out step by step. We've created a wrapper component, a div with an ID of wrapper. That's what this purple border looks like. We're centering everything in the middle within the wrapper. We have two parent components within that wrapper, one of them being the list container full of items and the option to delete. The other container is the form container with three elements: the label, the input, and the submit button. So if we were to submit this, we won't get anything back from the server because the server's not running, but it does show that the button works. And that's it for the front end code. Now that we are done with the front end, we can continue and move forward. I made some modifications by removing these borders or commenting them out, but you can always put them back if you need to see that structure. I took off some of these list items as well. We don't need these right now, but we will use their classes when we create our own list items and spans. So let's focus more on this form field. We have the method of post, we have the endpoint ready to go, and we have the send button. Now, if we access our folder tree, all right, we have a package.json within the server, and we have an index.js file. This file is empty, but we will be focusing on that server. So let's install the dependencies from package.json by saying npm i-y for yes. We're installing Express, Nodemon, cores, and body parser. Body parser is extremely important in translating the data we get from the body or the header, and we want to make that almost any data type. So let's check that out. We can go to our index.js and we can declare our dependencies for the server. Before we do this, we can dispose of live server. We won't be needing this anymore. We'll open a fresh tab and test this out once we have it. We'll define express. We're going to define cores. Let's define body parser as BP. And we're going to plug in express into app. That's our server. And finally, we need to define the port to listen on. We'll say 4556. Let's listen on the port, app.listen. We'll say port as the first argument and a callback as the second argument. This is where we're going to confirm that we are connected. Now we should be able to connect. Let's make sure the spelling's correct and we have the necessary dependencies. Great. Let's test it out. We will say a script called npm run dev. You are connected. Let's go to the endpoint. It shows that we are connected to the server, but we're not connected to a path or the home directory. Now, to bypass this, we can program that home directory by throwing it in. But first, let's throw in some middleware and pass in our necessary middleware, like app.use cores. We need to use the express JSON and body parser JSON. Body parser JSON pretty much identifies it as JSON data passing through the server and allowing it to pass through. And next we have app.use body parser dot URL encoded. This is saying that we're gonna verify the URL encoded through the header or the data being passed through the header. And the data being passed would typically be a string by default, but we're gonna extend that to more than just a string. So let's throw this URL encoded extended of true to identify more than just this standard string. And finally, we need that static path or the index HTML. App.use, and this is going to be the string, let's say express.static, which takes in the string path, which points to our client folder and public folder within. This should give us that index.html. So if we reset, we get just that. That matches what we had in the live server. We can even test this with JavaScript. We have a main.js file, but it is empty. So be sure to connect that to your index.html file with a script tag and directing it to main.js. Once you're there, let's test it out. It looks like the data, it works. So the terminal works here, and the terminal in my server is working too. So let's console out our routes. And the route we will be focusing on is that API to do. So let's focus on this form field. Take this API to do. Let's send a route of app.route path API to do with another function of post, not get. We're using post. We'll take two arguments of request and response with a callback for posting data to the server or client, posting it back. Now, to identify this post data we're going to use for the to-do list, we should identify with request.body. So we can console out rec.body. Now, whatever we type in here is going to get sent through this form field by sending it to this endpoint that we have here in the server and using this name property of to do. This name property will show up in that body's object. So I'll show you what I'm talking about here. Let's send the data. Post. And we get hello world back. So you can see this is an object with a property of to do, which matches that name field within form action. Since we know this, let's be awesome and throw this into a variable, const to do equals rec.body. Since we have to do, we can say res.json to do of to do. What am I doing? I am opening up a new JSON request to pretty much send the data of to do here. This is going to be the object or the value we send through the rec.body, and we're putting it in a new property called to do. So let's test this out. I'll say my name, Kyle. Let's post the information, and it takes us to that JSON object we created. Now, initially, this is not what we really don't want this to happen every time we post the information to the server. So to disable this function, to disable this form field from happening, let's create a new file. Go to your public folder in client, and if you don't have it already, just create that main.js. Alright, we already have it created. Excuse me. And we'll throw in our variables. We need to identify the button and the text input, just for now. Const input equals get the element by ID of to do input. And we'll call this button. And the IDs here is button. Since we have that, let's verify that we have our elements. Refresh the page. And we have the elements. We have the button and the text input. Now let's create an event listener to post data. Button dot onClick equals an event, which takes which sends a callback to post some data. But the first thing we need to do here is prevent the form from firing. To prevent the form from firing, we can pretty much prevent our data from showing up in JSON format like this. To prevent that from happening, throw in the button.onClick, use the event dot prevent default. This should prevent the data from firing, and we can even verify by consoling the inputs value. Hello. And we get hello back, but look at that, we don't have the browser updating, which is great thanks to this prevent default. Now we can proceed with our post function. So we're going to create a function called post fetch. This post fetch is going to take the place of this form field's button submit, because the submit doesn't work anymore. We disabled it with e.preventDefault. Now let's create our own way to post information and fetch at the same time. const post fetch equals two parameters. We're going to throw in a URL and data in JSON format. And this should return a callback of, we're going to call a response. Let response equal await. And since we're using await, we should use an async for the function. Await fetch. So we're going to await fetch the URL and the data that is being passed, but we don't put in data, we throw an object, and in this object we want to get in a few properties. One of them being the type of method, in this case it's post. Secondly, we need the headers to identify what type of data is being passed. And one header we need here is content type, which we set to application-JSON. And finally, we need the body, the meat and potatoes of our request, and that is going to be the data itself. So we can say JSON.stringify data. Once we have all of this, we can return response.json. Okay. Since we have this, we need to identify two things, one of them being the URL and the other one being the data that we're sending. So thankfully we have our data input.value. Let's place that into an object. Let data object equal to do with input.value. Let data equal data. Actually, we'll just keep it as data object. And finally, the URL we need is API to do. Once we have those two things, let's throw our function post fetch of URL and data object. Now, we are returning the response in JSON format, so all we have to send here is a .then function and identify a parameter. Let's see, data, which returns console.log data. Okay, now I'll explain what I'm doing here. We just created a function called postFetch that is asynchronous and takes two things, URL and data. We are creating a response by giving its headers, the body that we need to send the text value, and we're returning this in JSON format. Once we return that, we can throw on a follow-on function and console the data on the client's end. At the same time, this data, it's going to console. We can console it out here, and it's going to console in the server since we already have it programmed. Now let's test this out and see if we get data both on the client and in the server. Testing. And it works. We have the server saying, hey, I just consoled out rec.body, which is coming from our text value. This is not coming from the form because the form is not fired. We disabled that function. Since we disabled, we have pretty much created our own with a postFetch function, an asynchronous function that creates a response and sends a response in JSON format. Once that's sent, the client, creates that function, and then they want to see the data on their side saying console.log the data, which is line 26. If you want to console the value, console.log data.todo, which matches the property's name. You can do the same exact thing here. Testing 1, 2, 3, and we get that on the client's end. So as you can see, we have both the objects coming from the server and the client. Now we can manipulate the DOM. So again, while we're doing this, let's create our to-dos. Const. Actually, we'll create a function called create to do, and we just need the data dot to do to be passed in. So we're taking that value from the object. Const create to do equals data, which returns a method. And for this method, before we start, let's console, take out all the unnecessary consoles. And we're going to focus solely on this create to do here. Data is going to be anything I put in this text value. So let's create some elements. Const li equals document dot create element list item. And this list item is going to have that button. So const exit equals document dot create element of, what was that, a span? Great. Once we have these elements created, we must identify this list container if we want to append it there. But first, we can just add some attributes to the list items and the exit. So, for example, we can say li.textContent equals data, or the to-do. And for the exit, we're just going to simply append it to that li. But before we append it, we need to say which class the li is in. So li.set attribute class of, what do we give it? List item. And for the button, we also gave that a class as well. So if we go back to the index.html, we can find it here commented out, and the class is delete, or del. Let's set its attribute to del. Alternatively, you could use class list. So you can say exit.classlist.add, and you can add the class. But I just wanted to do it a different way and give you that example. But I'll comment this out if you decide to do it this way. Exit.set attribute class del, and we have the li's attributes class set as well. Once those are set, we can safely append the exit to the li. Exit dot append, no, li dot append child exit. Now the last thing we need to do is identify that list container, so, or the ul, const list container equals a query selector of list container actual. This list container is going to append these LIs one by one on each post. So list container dot append child list item. And the list container has the necessary class for what we need. So let's test this out and see what we get. It looks like we get exactly what we need. Except for the fact that we need to put an X within the exit. So that's simple. We'll change the text content. Exit.text content equals a big fat X. Testing out. And it looks like it works. We also get this information back from the server. So now you can see how we pretty much we used an alternative method of initiating that submit. Within this form field, the submit would typically work, but we disabled its firing method. We used event.preventDefault. Because of that, this action is not going to be read. The method is not going to be read. Nothing's going to be read at all because we plugged everything in ourselves in our post fetch function. Now that you understand this, we're just going to work on one more thing here before we close, which is closing or exiting, completing or taking off the tasks. Let's refresh the page. Now let's create a variable to capture all the delete buttons. Const dells equal document dot get query selector all of del. Hey, hey, and hey. Now that we have all of our heys, let's console.log dells. And they won't console out because we're not tracking it outside of the function. We got to track it inside. Since we're tracking this inside, let's go back to our create to do. Under list container append child, we're going to target all of those delete buttons while we have them up, and we can just console it out. And it seems to be creating that list of spans. That's what we need here. So for every button that we have on each update, we must throw for each function. We can say dells.forEach delete for each D, and let's console it out. And we're getting every span here, which is great. So we can give them an onClick function. And this onClick function is going to allow us to delete this to-do. So what we're going to do here is target this list and compare it with the to-do that is in the list and delete that to-do. So let's identify to-do, identify the list item. Let li or let item equal document, no, equal e.target.parent element. We console the item out. Let's comment that out. Now on each press, if we press on a button, we should be able to see the list item. And it looks like we do, where it's with each corresponding list item that it's next to. So the test does pass. Once that passes, we now need to delete this list item from the list container. So since we have the list item identified, all you have to do here, take list container and say list container dot remove child item. So on a red button click, that item should be deleted. Let's test it out. We'll post 1 and let's check the server too. 1 gets sent to the server, which sends it back to us. 2 sends to the server, it sends back to us. And finally 3. Once we have 1, 2, and 3, let's delete 1. Before we delete, let's clear up this style here. I want to use a pointer. Let's give it the del cursor of pointer. Refresh. 1, 2, and 3. Now if we delete 2, it's gone. Delete 1, it's gone. Let's add some more. Let's add another. And let's add pancake. Delete, 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 delete. So that's how you can go ahead and create your to-do list. Say walking the dog, create a plan. And if you want to get a little bit cleaner with this to-do list without having to delete it yourself all the time, on each post we should be able to, or even on the create to-do function, once we do all of this, we can just send the value back to, not to an empty string. So where do we target the input value? Right here. Once that's created, we'll say input dot value equals an empty string. Let's test it out. It goes back to nothing, so that's exactly what we want. And we can still delete, create, and delete. And that is how you can utilize the post function in the Express server. So what we're doing here is having the data within our index. We're creating a route for post requests. In our form, once we press this button, we're using this to talk to the server, and on our main.js file, we are using this post fetch function where we are creating a response and getting information from the header. Now we're posting back to the server by returning this JSON. Once it returns here, we're reading the data from the client, and the data is going to get sent back to the client because we want to console it out. We want to use the client's data within the domain. And that is your post fetch function.